legal discussion amongst the major writers of Jewish law who question the status of Abraham, and for that matter, Isaac and Jacob. Were they just Bnei Noach, descendants of Noah, in other words, a member of humanity with the 7 Noahide commandments, which every human being is obligated to observe, so that Abraham's status was no different from any other person that lived at that time, maybe a little enhanced? Or was he a separate legal entity, that he had a different status? And there are arguments back and forth. In fact, a 17th century author posits that Joseph and his brothers were essentially arguing about that very concept. What was their status? And this is not the time and place to go into detail what their argument revolved around, except that it revolved around the question as to what was their legal identity. But there are different sources that seem to contradict one another. A 20th century rabbi known as the Rogatchover, he came from the city of Rogatchover. Some people here are familiar with that city. It's a small town, I guess, in Belarus, but he turned out to be the greatest Talmudic scholar of the 20th century. His name was Joseph Rosen, and he was just phenomenal, but this is not the place to discuss his biography. But in one of his works, he says the following. He says that Abraham obviously could not have had the status of a Jew at the time that he lived. But when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and the Jewish people became a nation chosen by God with special responsibilities and separated from all other nations forever, Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob became Jews retroactively. The way I understand that is that whenever you see a major upheaval in the world, a revolution, there are 2 ways of looking at it. If the revolution happened, let's say the communist revolution happened in early 20th century, you could talk about when it happened. But if you really want to understand it, you have to go back and find out what were the seeds that were planted that ultimately led to this revolution. Every major phenomenon doesn't just happen out of nowhere, out of the blue. There's always a pattern, there's always a initiative that eventually grows, develops, and then explodes into some major cataclysmic event. So the question can be asked, okay, God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. That was a revolution. In fact, that was the greatest revolution in all of human history. Never was there such a revolution and revelation at the same time, where God appears to an entire nation and gives them a constitution for all times, for eternity, and has a special relationship called the chosen people. Where did all this begin? It didn't come in a vacuum. So when we trace it back to its original point, we have to trace it back to Abraham, not further back to Noah or any other of the people who lived before Abraham, but Abraham and his relationship with God was the seed that was planted that ultimately led to what happened at Mount Sinai, the formation of a Jewish people. So when we ask, was Abraham a Jew? The answer is, in his own day, he couldn't have been considered anything different from anyone else. He was not chosen to be different from anyone else, although I'll qualify that a little bit. But he did lay the foundation, the groundwork, planted the seeds, paved the way, whichever metaphor you want to use, that ultimately led to the formation of the Jewish people. So in that sense, Abraham was the first Jew. But at what point in Abraham's life did that really take place? And there's no uniform answer to that, because they're all true, because there are different stages in Abraham's life. Many authorities maintain that Abraham became the first Jew at the time that he went through circumcision, because that was the only commandment he really had that was in addition to the 7 Noahide commandments that every human being has to follow. When was he given an additional commandment that became the foundation of the Jewish teachings and commandments that were given later at Mount Sinai? When did that start? When he was given the commandment to do circumcision. That's when he became the first Jew. Others will argue, no, it happened a lot earlier. When God says to Abraham, Lech lecha, which we just read yesterday, Lech lecha, get going, leave your home, your father's home, your homeland, your birthplace, leave all of that to an unknown destination. When Abraham accepted that responsibility, that mission, that's when he became a Jew.
Can't get the other way.
Some people will argue that it started earlier. The first event that we know of in Abraham's life, the first major event, but it's not mentioned in the Torah, it's hinted in the Torah, was what happened in his homeland, in his birthplace, Ur Kasdim, where he was thrown into a fiery furnace because he refused to bow down to idols at the behest of the king Nimrod, and he came out alive miraculously, but he didn't know he was going to come out alive. He was prepared to die for his belief in one God. So some will argue that's when he became the first Jew, because he was the first person to take monotheism. As we discussed last week, there were other monotheists before him, many other monotheists before him, but he was the first one to take it on his shoulders, the responsibility to spread the idea, the belief in one God. It's not just my private religious belief. This will become the accepted belief of all humanity. That was the goal. And that goal has not yet been realized fully. In the Messianic age, that's when the entire world, as the prophet says repeatedly, everyone will recognize that God is one and his name is one. That God is not a composite, God is not dual, he's not a trinity, he's not any kind of combination with anything else. There's only one God, and there's nothing else that has control over our lives besides God. And of course, monotheism goes deeper and deeper, but that's essentially the belief that Abraham popularized, and he risked his life to spread it to the world. Now what's interesting, there's a book, I can't remember the name of the book, I just saw it mentioned this morning, and I can't remember it. You know, 2 things happen when you get older, I forgot what they are. And the book is about demonstrating through historical evidence, archaeological evidence, that the notion of one God was spreading to the rest of the world in Abraham's lifetime. That other cultures were beginning to pick up. There's a city in Syria that they uncovered a few decades ago called Ebla. And the Syrian government is very scared of that, because it shows that there was a whole civilization in that part of the world, and it matches many biblical stories. In other words, historians used to say 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that everything in the Torah about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's all myth, that's all fiction. Someone made up some names, Abraham. There's no such name in those days. Well, the discovery of Ebla proved that yes, there are some names that are similar to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob. These were common names, and many of the events in the Torah are actually corroborated, not that I think that Torah needs corroboration, but they are corroborated by those discoveries. And the Syrian government has took one of the archaeologists and made him sign a thing that everything he said over there was wrong, and he had to apologize for it. And since he didn't apologize enough, he was fired. So there's the whole area of research that's being controlled by the Syrians, because they don't want people to know that the Bible has any truth to it. At any rate, we already saw Abraham's influence in his own lifetime, that the notion of monotheism started to become popular. And the only reason we still have it today is because of Abraham's contribution. So we could say that Abraham became the first Jew later on in life, when he was 99, when he circumcised himself, which was the first commandment that he received, in addition to the 7 Noahide commandments that he shared with all other people, all other members of humanity. Or it started maybe when he was told by God to leave everything behind and separate himself from his past, to start a new venture. You could say that's when he became the first Jew. Or maybe when he was even younger and he risked his life to spread the idea of monotheism in his own homeland, in his own country. If you want to say that he became a Jew at any one of those junctures, no one's going to argue with you. You will not be penalized for believing that, because everything has its genesis and the genesis of the genesis. Now, Abraham, in fact, you could say not just these 3. Abraham went through, the Mishnah tells us, 10 tests in his life. Actually, there's more than 10, but somehow 10 were highlighted. So I want to go through the 10 tests and talk a little bit about them, the ones that need to be clarified. The first test, according to many of the commentators, was the one I mentioned before, that he was prepared to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And it's hinted in the Torah. The word, his homeland was called Ur Kasdim. The word Ur means fire. So the fire of Kasdim, that he was thrown into that fire. And there are other little hints throughout the Torah as to that event of Abraham thrown into a fiery furnace. What does that tell us? That Abraham was a person who was willing to sacrifice his life for his beliefs. That's not unique to Abraham or to Judaism. Every culture, every religion, every secular ideology has its martyrs, where they are convinced that their cause is absolutely crucial and they're willing to die for their cause. So in this regard, one could argue Abraham was unique. I mean, how many people are willing to die for their beliefs? But there are other people, and we presume that in his own day and age, there were people who were willing to die for their beliefs. Even godless people, even communists, even the people who don't believe in an afterlife. But somehow they're so motivated that they will be prepared to die. Jewish people, and perhaps we got this from Abraham, were a little different. Jewish martyrs are qualitatively different from martyrs of every other religion and ideology. What propels a person to become a martyr? They are brainwashed, conditioned to believe that their cause is so great that it's more important than their own life. And that becomes their agenda. They're fanatically attached to it. They're willing to go to the extreme for their cause, whether it's the kamikazes in Japan, whether it's the members of every religion, Buddhists who put themselves on fire and were willing to die for their cause. Every religion has its martyrs. But in order to become a martyr, you have to be steeped in your religion. You have to be so steeped in your religion that you're willing to die for it. When Jews died for their religion throughout Jewish history, the simple Jews were the ones who were more prepared to die than the more involved Jews. In fact, there were so many stories of Jews who were completely irreligious or a-religious, totally not interested in Judaism, who were even hostile to Judaism. But when it came to a test, do you want to die, or would you embrace another religion? There are thousands of cases where they died rather than even pay lip service to another religion. Somehow, where did they get that from? They were not trained. They didn't believe in it. They said they didn't believe in it. They were not conditioned. They were not brainwashed. They were not educated. And yet, somehow, there was something in them that produced this need to die, what's called al-kiddush Hashem, to sanctify the name of God. Where do they get this from? One could suggest that we inherited this from Abraham. So Abraham's giving up his life was not just dying for your own belief system, but it's an intrinsic thing that he had the seeds of this new nation that will become connected, so connected to God that they just can't do it any other way. They just can't imagine themselves living a lie. The second test is where he was told to leave his birthplace. That's actually the first test that's mentioned in the Torah. God tells him, Lech lecha, go for yourself, me'artzecha, from your land, mimoladetecha, from your birthplace, umibeis avicha, from your father's home. Detach yourself completely from your past. In a way, that's a greater test than the first one. If you're all motivated, you're just worked up to promote your own belief system, and you convince yourself that your life is only worth something if you can promote this belief system, and you're willing to die for it, we can understand that. It's easier to die for your beliefs than to live for them. It sounds strange, but living for your beliefs is harder, because it's dying is what takes place in 1 day, 1 minute, one second. But living your beliefs is a constant thing. And Abraham here was told to detach himself from everything of his past and to start something totally new.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Which is greater on the part of Abraham? If he did it voluntarily, or if he did it because God commanded him to do it?
The question was, which would be greater, if Abraham did it voluntarily or he was commanded to do it? That's exactly the point here. When he was prepared to die for his cause, God didn't speak to him. He had no communication with God. That was based on his own understanding. How did Abraham even know there's one God? He didn't get it from his parents. His parents were idolaters. And Abraham himself was an idolater in his youth. There's a question how old he was when he finally came to the realization that there's one God. But it started at the age of 3. He started to speculate. And he saw the sun, the powerful sun. That must be God. When the sun set and the moon took its place, the moon must be God. When the moon disappeared in the morning, he realized that neither is God. And he started to think and think until he realized that if the world is in motion, there must be a prime mover. That's how Maimonides describes it. There must be a force that moves everything. Then he realized that this force can't be limited in any way. If it's limited, then how does it have the ability to keep things going forever? And he came to the final conclusion that this God is beyond the universe. He created the universe, and he is involved in our lives and in our existence. God didn't tell him this. He did all on his own. But for some reason, the Torah does not feel important to tell us this story, because the story that it tells us is the story where God speaks to him and commands him. There's a statement in the Talmud that you are accomplishing more when you're commanded to do something than if you do it voluntarily, which is counterintuitive. Most people would say what you volunteer for shows your real personality, your character. A person who volunteers to help other people, that's a beautiful thing, and no one argues with that. But the Talmud says when you're commanded to do it and you do it, that's even greater. Why? Because when you're commanded to do it, that's when all the obstacles in the world try to prevent you from doing it. When you're doing it because you want to do it, it's an extension of your ego. Now, we should all have an ego that tells us to do good for others. If that's what our ego is all about, let everyone here have big egos. No one's complaining about using your ego to do good for others. But it's not the ideal. It's not the ideal. The ideal is when you're able to give your life over to God in fulfilling His commandments. That's one explanation. Another one is when you do something on your own, you're not connected to God because you're so finite. Now, how could you connect to something that is totally infinite? But when you do a mitzvah, the word mitzvah means bond. You know, everyone always hears that a mitzvah is a good deed. That's true, but that's not what the word means. The word mitzvah means commandment and bond. But when you do a mitzvah, you're following God's commandment, and therefore, since God commands you, God created the possibility of bonding with Him. You can't go from one side of the ocean to the other without a boat. If you don't have a boat, you can't just say, I'll jump to the other side. You can't do that. But if someone builds a bridge, you can do that. Now, as far as I know, no one has ever tried to build a bridge across the Atlantic. Certainly not across the Pacific. So how do you get across? You have to have, it's not possible unless you have a boat or a plane. But what about a bridge? You can't. But God creates the bridge. God could create a bridge across the ocean. So the gulf between us and God is much wider than the gulf between one side of the ocean and the other side. So there's no way we could connect to God on our own. We need God to do the connection. And how does God make that connection? By saying to us, I want you to do this. By virtue of Him saying that, He created the means, the mechanism, the bridge to cross over from the infinite God to the finite human being. So when you do something that you're commanded to do, not only will you have more pressure, but it has more validity because you're really creating a bond. Things that you do on your own are nice, they're beautiful, they're desirable, but only when they're icing on the cake. You ever see people eating cake with icing? Yes. But do you ever see people eating the icing without the cake? Don't say yes. Yeah, we do see some people, but that's not exactly the most appetizing thing. If you volunteer, but you don't do what you're commanded to do, it's like eating icing. When you're commanded to do something and you do more than that voluntarily, that's the icing on the cake. So Abraham, when he was giving his life for God, that was all his own initiative. And that's admirable and praiseworthy and everything else you could say about it, but that was the icing. That's why, that explains one reason why the Torah doesn't tell us that story. We know it from the oral tradition, but in the written text of the Torah, we don't read about Abraham's youth. In fact, we don't know anything about Abraham until God speaks to him when he's 75 years old. That's pretty young, of course, but he had a whole life of 75 years filled with a lot of things that he did, and even sacrificing his life, intending to do so. And the Torah doesn't tell us about it, because what he did before he was 75 was his own initiative. What he did when he was 75 was God giving him a commandment, telling him, I want you to leave. I want you to go away from where you were and start a new life. And when he complied with that, that created a bridge that he did not have before. The next test was, God tells him, go to this land. I'll show you this land. This is a wonderful land. You will be blessed. You will be blessed with money. You will be blessed with fame. You will be blessed. People will bless you. People will praise you. He really tells them some very exciting things will happen when you move. What happens when he moves? What happens when he comes to the land? Relax? No, he couldn't relax. A famine breaks out. Only there. No food. People are starving to death. And he was forced to leave to go to Egypt. What would most other people say? God, you promised me something. Not only did your promise not come true, the opposite came true. Instead of me making money, instead of me becoming famous, instead of me being prospering and being praised and everything, I have to run away. I'm a refugee now. Yes?
Why did then Abraham tell Sarah, tell them you're my sister, rather than just trust God, that he'll take care of it since God was telling him to do it? Why did he tell Sarah this?
Okay, very good question. I don't know if we have time to go into that part, but the question is, he tells Sarah, you're a beautiful woman, the Egyptians are going to take you away, they'll kill me. Interestingly, they don't want to commit adultery, but murder is okay. Evil doesn't have to be consistent. You know, when an evil person says something positive and then they say something negative, you say, oh, that's inconsistent, you're a hypocrite, so I'm evil. Well, that's my job. It's only good people have to be consistent. Evil people don't have to be consistent. So, but anyhow, he tells his wife, tell everybody we're brother and sister, that way I won't be harmed. So your question is, why didn't he believe in God? That God will protect him. So the Zohar says that he did really believe that God would protect Sarah. He was convinced that she was much more righteous than he. But he knew, and he looked at himself, he said, I'm so deficient, maybe I'm not worthy, and she'll survive and I won't. That's the way the Zohar explains it. But there's something else interesting that adds to the question. He says, not only will I survive, but I will be benefited from this. Rashi says they will give me gifts. Here his wife is being abducted by Pharaoh, and he's thinking about the gifts he's going to get. This is really fodder for anti-Semites. You trace yourselves back to Abraham, and his wife is being abducted. He's thinking about the gifts. Will they be gift wrapped? Will there be a nice ribbon? You know, that's how a holy person thinks. So the answer is that no, he wasn't thinking about gifts because he wanted gifts. In fact, Rashi tells us that he never used those gifts. He gave them away. He didn't want to benefit from those gifts. But he knew that God promised him that he'll become wealthy. So he figured, this must be God's plan for me to become wealthy. So this is all part of God's plan. See, there are two ways you could look at God's protection. Sometimes you could look at it, God is going to perform a miracle and just everything will disappear, everything negative will disappear. Sometimes God does the miracle through natural means, that sometimes negative things happen in a way to provide you with benefits. You know the story of the flood, the person is on the roof and he turns to God, he says, God, please save me, and a rowboat comes and he says, no, God is going to save me. The water goes higher and higher. A larger boat comes and tries to take him. He says, no, God. God is going to save me. Then a helicopter comes and tries to pick him up. And again, he says, God will save me. And he drowns. And he comes to God and he says, God, I had such trust in you. Why didn't you save me? He said, I sent you a boat, then a ship, and then a helicopter. Why didn't you take advantage of it? Sometimes God does things through a natural means. The miracles don't have to always be supernatural. They could come through a natural mechanism. So Abraham figured, why is God tells me to go to this land? He says everything will be great. Then he forces me to leave. Creates this famine only in this land. The land that God promised me everything is the worst possible land in the world. So he figured that God is probably doing it as a way to fulfill his other promises, that there'll be a temporary lull, and that will provide me with the things that God promised. So that's how he was looking at it. He was looking at it, and that's a way, when things happen in the world, there's two ways of looking at it. If they're negative things, these are negative things, and we pray to God to get rid of them, but we also look and see, when we see how it can also feed into something positive and look for the positive in everything. So the third test was the famine. The fourth test was Pharaoh's abduction of Sarah. The fifth test was the war with 4 kings. What was that war about? Abraham lived in Canaan. God promised him the land. And what happens, there's a war between an alliance of 4 kings against another alliance of 5 kings. His nephew Lot, who lived in Sodom, was captured by the 4 kings who were winning the war. And Abraham almost single-handedly fought against the 4 kings and defeated them and liberated his nephew. Again, he risked his life to save his nephew. And that was a major test, that here, the God promises you this land. That means it's yours, and you have to fight a war for your own relatives' well-being. He could have questioned God and said, God, why are you doing all this? But he didn't question. He knew that everything that God did had a purpose. While he didn't understand the purpose, he couldn't fathom it, he knew that it was going to be for a good reason. The next test was the covenant between the pieces. God made a covenant with him. And in this covenant, God tells him, you're going to have children. They're going to inherit this land. But they will also be tortured as slaves beforehand. And this darkness, he's shrouded in darkness in this dream, trance-like state that he was in, because he was being told about the suffering of his children. How many people would be happy when God comes to them and says, you know what, I'm choosing you, you're a very special person, and your children are all going to suffer. And everything that God said about them suffering came true throughout history. So how does a father feel when God is telling him about the suffering of his children? And again, Abraham did not have any more doubts. He passed that test. The next test was circumcision. You tell a person at the age of 99 to go through self-surgery, auto-surgery. Any candidates here? 99 to do circumcision. And this was, in a way, a much more difficult thing, not just because, an older person doing surgery without any anesthetic is very difficult, but it doesn't last that long. But here, Abraham was going to put a mark on himself that separated him from the rest of the world. That was a great test and challenge. Why? For two reasons. Number one, as much as he was separated from the rest of the world by his ideology, he was not separated from the rest of the world physically. He was, you can't tell a person's ideology by looking at them. But when he is going to be separated physically, and his progeny as well, his children as well, so this was a real cutting off from the rest of society, and it would only create enmity and hatred by the rest of society. Oh, you're better than us, you're different, you have to change your physical appearance because you're better than everyone, you're chosen. So that was one challenge, one test. And another challenge was, this got in the way of his mission. What was Abraham's mission? To spread monotheism, and not just monotheism, we discussed this last week, ethical monotheism. Because to believe in one God, a God who is a God of vice, who justifies our vices, is no big deal. It's not any better than having two gods who tell you to do things that are improper, immoral, and illegal. It's the ethical component to this monotheism, that there's one God who wants justice, who wants kindness, who wants peace. And he was spreading that notion to the rest of the world. What would happen now that he is circumcised and separates himself from the rest of society? People would say, Abraham, we don't want to listen to you anymore. You're really outside the pale. The Midrash tells us that Abraham consulted with a friend of his name was Mamre, whether he should do the circumcision. And the commentators ask, Abraham had to consult whether he should fulfill God's commandment? And the answer given is that he didn't consult whether he should circumcise himself, but he consulted him whether he should publicize it. Why was he concerned about publicizing it? Because by publicizing it, that would cut him away from the rest of society. That would create a schism. That would create a barrier between himself and the rest of society, and he would not be able to accomplish his mission. if you are identified by a certain philosophy, people try to shy away. I know from personal experience. If I try to talk to someone about Judaism, for some reason they think that I might be a little different. I look a little different from the rest of men in society today. You know, you have a beard, you wear a yarmulke, and sometimes that poses a barrier between me and the other people. And they say, well, we're not comfortable talking to someone who is so different. If someone goes undercover and doesn't have all the trappings of a Hasidic Jew, they could be more effective sometimes. So Abraham had this dilemma. Should I do this privately? No one is going to know about it, and that way everyone will say I'm just like them and they'll be more receptive to me. Or perhaps I should be proud of who I am and do it openly. Let the whole world know that I am circumcised, that I am different. And Mamre, who was not a Jew, who was someone he was friendly with, said, don't be embarrassed. Do it in public. Very often, I know of stories where Jews were embarrassed to do things openly, and they had to be told by non-Jews not to be embarrassed. I don't know if some of you may have heard of David Lazarson. I think he was a student of your father. Yeah, so when he started teaching special ed in Buffalo public schools, and he was embarrassed to wear his yarmulke. So he came with a baseball hat. And his African-American principal goes over to him and says, if you want to make a statement, wear your yarmulke, don't wear your hat in my school. If you want to make a statement, do it openly. He had to be told by an outsider not to be embarrassed with his own appearance. So that was a dilemma Abraham had. If that's going to separate him, he may lose his ability to be influential. So he consulted with the people he was trying to inspire. What do you think? And the people said, we will respect you more if you don't hide your identity. The eighth one was Avimelech. He was the Philistine king. He abducted Sarah as well. She goes through this a second time. Now, the first time you go through something, you could say, well, it's a test. But God, why are you doing it a second time? I already passed that test. That sometimes the bigger test is when things go badly, and then everything works out, and then it happens again. Is it easier? Is the second test easier than the first test? No, it's harder. But you know already that things do work out. But I already went through that. Why do I have to go through that again? And yet, he didn't question. Then he has a child from his concubine, Hagar, Ishmael. Now he grows up, he becomes a rival to Isaac, and Sarah says, I don't want him in this home because he's a negative influence. According to the Talmud and the Midrash, he tried to kill Isaac. There was not just a little bit of jealousy there, but it was much more serious than that. And he had to expel his own child. For Abraham, that was the worst. The Abraham, the man, the paragon of love, and especially his own child. And then the ultimate test was the binding of Isaac, which we'll go into more next week, God willing. Any questions? Yes?
I'm curious about like the status of Judaism for Abraham and Isaac and their partners, their wives, and Abraham's mother. What is the consideration?
Abraham's mother was not Jewish because there was no such thing as being Jewish then. And even Abraham couldn't have been Jewish in the way we refer to it today. And that's why I came up with that explanation that he was a Jew retroactively. Once there was a Jewish nation, and you have to trace it back. Where did it all begin? What was the genesis of it? You trace it back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but all the way back to Abraham. Abraham's father and mother, no. Abraham's children, Ishmael and others, no. They didn't contribute to it in any way, so they couldn't be given the status of Jew even retroactively. Yes?
Why did Sarah seemingly get angry at Abraham because of Hagar's, what she felt was Hagar as being uppity to her? Mm-hmm. Why did Sarah blame Abraham for that?
It's one of the reasons a co-wife in Hebrew is called a tzara. a misfortune. They're enemies to each other. It's the worst possible position to be in, to be a co-wife. Okay? And it brings out the worst in people when you have that rivalry. But on a spiritual level, Sarah was very defensive of Abraham's spirituality. And now that Hagar, who was a daughter of Pharaoh, an idolater, was having the upper hand, that was giving strength to the unholy forces in her mind. So she couldn't tolerate that would be undermining their whole purpose and whole plan. Maybe next week we'll talk more about Sarah herself. But Sarah's job and the jobs of the matriarchs, among the things that they shared with the patriarchs, they had an additional responsibility. The patriarchs, men in general, are not able to discriminate, in a positive way discriminating, as much as women. Men are much more, everything goes. They're men. Right? They don't think about consequences. They don't think about, to them everything goes. A woman is much more discriminatory. So when you bring someone in your home, a man will say, bring him in, what do I care? He's a human being. And the woman will say, yeah, but he's going to kill you. Forget it, don't worry about that. So they were guardians. The matriarchs, in addition to everything else about them that is positive, they were also guardians.
That idea remains to the present, where people think of Jewish men as needing mothers to take care of them. That stereotype remains.
Well, there's a lot of truth to it.
Maybe there is, but it's still a stereotype.
Okay. Nothing is always universal. I mean, there are many exceptions to that. Yes?
So God builds man. And physically, I don't know about spiritually, a little bit later Jewish. Can the Adam be first Jewish after that people forget about this?
People forget about what?
But they are Jewish and separated. Can the Adam be first Jewish?
No, because he didn't contribute anything to the world except for he gave life to the world, but the animals also give life. That's not, he failed his major test. God told him not to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree of knowledge, and he ate it. The first test that he was given, he blew it. So he had many qualities, I'm sure, but the qualities are nothing when you can't fulfill your mission. If you hire someone to do a job in your business, and the person turns out fails, you fire that person. Because you know that your business is going to fall apart if you have someone who's incompetent. So he failed the test. Noach failed the test. Doesn't mean he wasn't a good person, but he wasn't good for the job. You can't hire someone just because they're nice, you like them, if they can't do the job. And Abraham did the job, and that's why he qualified. Yes?
Last question. And it's sort of like, I wanted to get your feedback on this teaching that I heard someplace, that 7 is the number of God's creation, and 8 is the number of man, God's covenant with man. Is there? There was such a thing like that.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll continue this, God willing, next week. Any questions on the Zoom? No? Okay. Everyone have a good day, a good week.
Probably. Class on Wednesday, our class.
Yeah, but it'll have to be, our mincha is now 4:40 and it ends about 5:30. So if you want to come 5:30 instead of 5.
5:30.
Yeah.
Don't understand why.